Hi and welcome. Happy Friday to you. I'm Mary, a librarian at the Claremont Branch Library. Glad to have you joining again as we are continuing with our readings of the Oz books. Today is our third day into the book Tick-Tock of Oz by L. Frank Baum. In yesterday's reading, we met Betsy Bobbin and her mule Hank, who got shipwrecked and ended up in the Rose Kingdom in the land of Oz. While there, they met up with the Shaggy Man, who is looking for his lost brother. The Shaggy Man and Betsy decided to pluck a royal rose named Ozga, but the roses in the Rose Kingdom refused to be ruled by a queen, and they want a king. So the roses and the royal gardener force Hank, Betsy, the Shaggy Man, and Ozga out of the Rose Kingdom. That's where we're going to pick up today with our reading in Chapter 7. It is called Polychrome's Pitiful Plight. The Rain King got too much water in his basin and spilled some over the brim. That made it rain in a certain part of the country, a real hard shower for a time, and sent the rainbow scampering to the place to show the gorgeous colors of his glorious bow as soon as the mist of the rain had passed and the sky was clear. The coming of the rainbow is always a joyous event to earth folk, yet few have ever seen it close by. Usually, the rainbow is so far distant that you can observe its splendid hues but dimly, and that is why we seldom catch sight of the dancing daughters of the rainbow. In the barren country where the rain had just fallen, there appeared to be no human beings at all, but the rainbow appeared just the same, and dancing gaily upon its arch were the rainbow's daughters, led by the fairy-like Polychrome, who is so dainty and beautiful that no girl has ever quite equaled her in loveliness. Polychrome was in a merry mood and danced down the arch of the bow to the ground, daring her sisters to follow her. Laughing and gleeful, they also touched the ground with their twinkling feet. But all the daughters of the rainbow knew that this was a dangerous pastime, so they quickly climbed upon their bow again. All but Polychrome. Though the sweetest and the merriest of them all, she was likewise the most reckless. Moreover, it was an unusual sensation to pat the cold, damp earth with her rosy toes. Before she realized it, the bow had lifted and disappeared into the billowy blue sky, and here was Polychrome standing helpless upon a rock, her gauzy draperies floating about her like brilliant cobwebs, and not a soul, fairy or mortal, to help her regain her lost bow. "Dear me," she exclaimed, a frown passing across her pretty face. "I'm caught again. This is the second time my carelessness has left me on earth while my sisters returned to our sky palaces. The first time I enjoyed some pleasant adventures, but this is a lonely, forsaken country, and I shall be very unhappy until my rainbow comes again, and I can climb aboard. Let me think what is best to be done." She crouched low upon the flat rock, drew her draperies about her, and bowed her head. It was in this position that Betsy Bobbin spied Polychrome as she came along the stony path, followed by Hank and the Princess and Shaggy. At once, the girl ran up to the radiant daughter of the rainbow and exclaimed, "Oh, what a lovely, lovely creature!" Polychrome raised her golden head. There were tears in her blue eyes. "I'm the most miserable girl in the whole world," she sobbed. The others gathered around her. "Tell us your troubles, pretty one," urged the princess. I've lost my bow," wailed Polychrome. "Take me, my dear," said Shaggy Man in a sympathetic tone, thinking that she meant beau as in boyfriend instead of beau. "I don't want you," cried Polychrome, stamping her foot imperiously. "I want my rainbow." "Oh, that's different," said Shaggy. "But try to forget it. When I was young, I used to cry for the rainbow myself, but I couldn't have it. Looks as if you couldn't have it either. So please, don't cry." Polychrome looked at him reproachfully. "I don't like you," she said. "No?" replied Shaggy, drawing the love magnet from his pocket. "Not a little bit? Just a wee speck of a like?" Yes, yes, said Polychrome, clasping her hands in ecstasy as she gazed at the enchanted talisman. I love you, Shaggy Man. Of course you do, he said calmly, but I don't take any credit for it. It's the Love Magnet's powerful charm. But you seem quite alone and friendless, little Rainbow. Don't you want to join our party till you find your father and sisters again? Where are you going? She asked. We don't know that, said Betsy, taking her hand. But we're trying to find Shaggy Man's long-lost brother, who has been captured by the terrible Metal Monarch. Won't you come with us and help us? Polychrome looked from one to the other of the queer party of travelers, and a bewitching smile suddenly lighted her face. A donkey, a mortal maid, a rose princess, and a shaggy man, she exclaimed. Surely you need help if you intend to face Ruggedo. You know him, then? Inquired Betsy. No, indeed. Ruggedo's caverns are beneath the earth's surface, where no rainbow can ever penetrate. But I've heard of the Metal Monarch. He is also called the Gnome King, you know, and he has made trouble for a good many people, mortals and fairies, in his time, said Polychrome. Oh, do you fear him, then? Asked the princess anxiously. No one can harm a daughter of the rainbow, said Polychrome proudly. I'm a sky fairy. Then, said Betsy quickly, you will be able to tell us the way to Ruggedo's cavern. No, returned Polychrome, shaking her head. That is one thing I cannot do. But I will gladly go with you and help you search for the place. This promise delighted all the wanderers, and after the Shaggy Man had found the path again, they began moving along it in a more happy mood. The Rainbow's daughter danced lightly over the rocky trail, no longer sad, but with her beautiful features wreathed in smiles. Shaggy came next, walking steadily and now and then supporting the Rose Princess, who followed him. Betsy and Hank brought up the rear, and if she tired with walking, the girl got upon Hank's back and let the stout little donkey carry her for a while. At nightfall, they came to some trees that grew beside a tiny brook, and here they made camp and rested until morning. Then away they tramped, finding berries and fruits here and there, which satisfied the hunger of Betsy, Shaggy, and Hank, so they were well content with their lot. It surprised Betsy to see the Rose Princess partake of their food, for she considered her a fairy. But when she mentioned this to Polychrome, the Rainbow's daughter explained that when Ozga was driven out of her Rose Kingdom, she ceased to be a fairy and would never again be more than a mere mortal. Polychrome, however, was a fairy wherever she happened to be, and if she sipped a few dewdrops by moonlight for refreshment, no one ever saw her do it. As they continued their wandering journey, direction meant very little to them, for they were hopelessly lost in this strange country. Shaggy said it would be best to go toward the mountains, as the natural entrance to Ruggedo's underground cavern was likely to be hidden in some rocky, deserted place. But mountains seemed all around them, except in the one direction that they had come from, which led to the Rose Kingdom and the sea. Therefore it mattered little which direction they traveled. By and by, they espied a faint trail that looked like a path, and after following this for some time, they reached a crossroads. Here were many paths leading in various directions, and there was a signpost so old that there were now no words upon the sign. At one side was an old well with a chain windlass for drawing water, yet there was no house or other building anywhere in sight. While the party halted, puzzled with which way to proceed, the mule approached the well and tried to look into it. He's thirsty, said Betsy. It's a dry well, remarked Shaggy. Probably there has been no water in it for many years. But come, let us decide which way to travel. No one seemed able to decide that. They sat down in a group and tried to consider which road might be the best to take. Hank, however, could not keep away from the well, and finally he reared up on his hind legs, got his head over the edge, and uttered a loud hee-haw. Betsy watched her animal friend curiously. I wonder if he sees anything down there, she said. At this, Shaggy rose and went over to the well to investigate, and Betsy went with him. The princess and Polychrome, who had become fast friends, linked arms and sauntered down one of the roads to find an easy path. Really, said Shaggy, There does seem to be something at the bottom of this old well. Can't we pull it up and see what it is? Asked the girl. There was no bucket at the end of the windlass chain, but there was a big hook that at one time was used to hold a bucket. Shaggy let down his hook, dragged it around on the bottom, and then pulled it up. An old hoop skirt came up with it, and Betsy laughed and threw it away. The thing frightened Hank, who had never seen a hoop skirt before, and he kept a good distance away from it. Several other objects the Shaggy Man captured with the hook drew up, but none of these were important. This well seems to have been the dump for all of the old rubbish in the country, he said, letting down the hook once more. I guess I've captured everything now. No, the hook is caught again. Help me, Betsy. Whatever this thing is, it's heavy. She reached up and helped him turn the windlass, and after much effort, a confused mass of copper came in sight. Good gracious, exclaimed Shaggy. Here is a surprise indeed. What is it? Inquired Betsy, clinging to the windlass, panting for breath. For the answer, the Shaggy Man grasped the bundle of copper and dumped it upon the ground, free of the well. Then he turned it over with his foot, spread it out, and to Betsy's astonishment, the thing proved to be a copper man. Just as I thought, said Shaggy, looking hard at the object. But unless there are two copper men in this world, this is one of the most astonishing things I ever came across. At this moment, the Rainbow's Daughter and the Rose Princess approached them. And Polychrome said, What have you found, Shaggy One? Either an old friend or a stranger, he replied. Oh, here's a sign on his back, cried Betsy, who had knelt down to examine the man. Dear me, how funny! Listen to this. Then she read the following words, engraved upon the copper plates of the man's body. Smith and Tinkers, patent double-action, extra-responsive, thought-creating, perfect-talking, mechanical man. Fitted with our special clockwork attachment, thinks, speaks, acts, and does everything but live. Oh, isn't he wonderful? Exclaimed the princess. Yes, but there's more, said Betsy, reading from another engraved plate. Directions for using. For thinking, wind the clockwork man under his left arm, marked number 1. For speaking, wind the clock man under his right arm, marked number 2. For walking and action, wind clockwork man in the middle of his back, marked number 3. N.B. This mechanism is guaranteed to work perfectly for 1,000 years. If he's guaranteed for 1,000 years, said Polychrome, he ought to work yet. Of course, replied Shaggy. Let's wind him up. In order to do this, they were obliged to set the copper man upon his feet in an upright position, and this was no easy task. He was inclined to topple over, and had to be propped up again and again. The girls assisted Shaggy, and at last Tick-Tock seemed to be balanced and stood alone upon his broad feet. Yes, said the Shaggy Man, looking at the copper man carefully, this must be, indeed, my old friend Tick-Tock, whom I left ticking merrily in the land of Oz. But how he came to this lonely place, got in that old well, is surely a mystery to me. If we wind him, perhaps he will tell us, suggested Betsy. Here's the key hanging to a hook on his back. What part of him shall I wind up first? His thoughts, of course, said Polychrome, for it requires thought to speak or move intelligently. So Betsy wound him under his left arm, and at once little flashes of light began to show in the top of his head, which was proof that he had begun to think. Now then, said Shaggy, wind up his phonograph. What's that? She asked. Why, his talking machine. His thoughts may be interesting, but they don't tell us anything. So Betsy wound the copper man under his right arm, and then from the interior of his copper body came in jerky tones the words, Many thanks. Hurrah! Cried Shaggy joyfully as he slapped Tick-Tock upon the back in such a hearty manner that the copper man lost his balance, tumbled to the ground in a heap. But the clockwork that enabled him to speak had been wound up, and he kept saying, Pick me up, pick me up, pick me up, until they had again raised him and balanced him upon his feet, when he added politely, Many thanks. "He won't be self-supporting until we wind up his action," remarked Shaggy. So Betsy wound it as tight as she could, for the key turned rather hard. And then Tik-Tok lifted his feet, marched around in a circle, and ended by stopping before the group and making them all a low bow. "How in the world did you happen to be in that well when I left you safe in Oz?" inquired Shaggy. "It is a long story," replied Tik-Tok, "but I'll tell it in a few words. After you had gone in search of your brother, Ozma saw you wandering in strange lands wherever she looked at her magic picture. And she also saw your brother in the Gnome King's cavern. So she sent me to tell you where to find your brother, and told me to help you if I could. The sorceress Glinda the Good transported me to this place in the wink of an eye. But here I met the Gnome King himself, old Ruggedo, who is called in these parts the Metal Monarch. Ruggedo knew what I had come for, and he was so angry that he threw me down the well. After my works ran down, I was helpless until you came along and pulled me out again. Many thanks." "This is indeed good news," said Shaggy. "I suspected that my brother was the prisoner of Ruggedo, but now I know it. Tell us, Tik-Tok, how shall we get to the Gnome King's underground cavern?" "The best way is to walk," said Tik-Tok. "We might crawl or jump or roll over and over until we get there, but the best way is to walk." "I know, but which road shall we take?" "My machinery isn't made to tell that," replied Tik-Tok. "There is more than one entrance to the underground cavern," said Polychrome, "but old Ruggedo has cleverly concealed every opening, so that earth dwellers cannot intrude in his domain. If we find our way underground at all, it will be by chance." "Then," said Betsy, "let us select any road haphazard, and see where it leads us." "That seems sensible," declared the princess. "It may require a lot of time for us to find Ruggedo, but we have more time than anything else." "If you keep me wound up," said Tik-Tok, "I will last 1,000 years." "Then the only question to decide is which way to go," added Shaggy, looking first at one road, then at the other. But while they stood hesitating, a peculiar sound reached their ears, a sound like the tramping of many feet. "What's coming?" cried Betsy, and then she ran to the left-hand road and glanced along the path. "Why, it's an army!" she exclaimed. "What shall we do? Hide or run?" "Stand still," commanded Shaggy. "I'm not afraid of an army. If they prove to be friendly, they can help us. If they are enemies, I'll show them the love magnet." Chapter 8. Tik-Tok Tackles a Tough Task. While Shaggy and his companions stood huddled in a group at one side, the army of Oogaboo was approaching along the pathway, the tramp of their feet being now and then accompanied by a dismal groan as one of the officers stepped on a sharp stone or knocked his funny bone against his neighbor's sword handle. Then, out from among the trees, marched Private Files, bearing the banner of Oogaboo, which fluttered from a long pole. This pole he stuck in the ground just in front of the well, and he cried in a loud voice, "I hereby conquer this territory in the name of Queen Anne, so forth, of Oogaboo, and all the inhabitants of the land I proclaim her slaves." Some of the officers now stuck their heads out of the bushes and asked, "Is the coast clear, Private Files?" "There is no coast here," was the reply, "but all's well." "I hope there's water in it," said General Cone, mustering courage to advance to the well. But just then he caught a glimpse of Tik-Tok and Shaggy, and at once fell upon his knees, trembling and frightened, and cried out, "Mercy, kind enemies, mercy! Spare us, and we will be your slaves forever." The other officers, who had now advanced into the clearing, likewise fell upon their knees and begged for mercy. Files turned around and seeing the strangers for the first time, examined them with much curiosity. Then, discovering that 3 of the party were girls, he lifted his cap and made a polite bow. "What's all this?" demanded a harsh voice as Queen Anne reached the place and beheld her kneeling army. "Permit us to introduce ourselves," replied Shaggy, stepping forward. "This is Tik-Tok, the Clockwork Man, who works better than some meat people. And here is Princess Ozga of Roseland, just now unfortunately exiled from her kingdom of roses. I present Polychrome, a sky fairy, who lost her bow by accident and can't find her way home. The small girl here is Betsy Bobbin, from some unknown earthly paradise called Oklahoma. And with her you see Mr. Hank, a mule with a long tail and a short temper." "Puh!" said Anne scornfully. "A pretty lot of vagabonds you are. Indeed, all lost or strayed, I suppose, and not worth a queen's plundering. I am sorry to have conquered you." "But you have not conquered us yet," called Betsy indignantly. "No," agreed Files, "that is a fact. But if my officers will kindly command me to conquer you, I will do so at once, after which we can stop arguing and converse more at our ease." The officers had by this time risen from their knees and brushed the dust from their trousers. To them, the enemy did not look very fierce, so the generals and colonels and majors and captains gained courage to face them and began strutting in their most haughty manner. "You must understand," said Anne, "that I am the Queen of Oogaboo, and this is my invincible army. We are busy conquering the world, and since you seem to be a part of the world, you are obstructing our journey. It is necessary for us to conquer you, unworthy though you may be of such a high honor." "That's all right," replied Shaggy. "Conquer us as often as you like. We don't mind." "But we won't be anybody's slaves," added Betsy positively. "We'll see about that," retorted the Queen angrily. "Advance, Private Files, and bind the enemy hand and foot." But Private Files looked at pretty Betsy and fascinating Polychrome and the beautiful Rose Princess, and shook his head. "It would be impolite, and I won't do it," he asserted. "You must!" cried Anne. "It is your duty to obey orders." "I haven't received any orders from my officers," objected the private. But the generals now shouted, "Forward and bind the prisoners!" And the colonels and majors and captains repeated the command, yelling it as loud as they could. All this noise annoyed Hank, who had been eyeing the army of Oogaboo with strong disfavor. The mule now dashed forward and began backing up upon the officers and kicking fierce and dangerous heels at them. The attack was so sudden that the officers scattered like dust in a whirlwind, dropping their swords as they ran and trying to seek refuge behind the trees and bushes. Betsy laughed joyously at the comical rout of the noble army, and Polychrome danced with glee. But Anne was furious at this ignoble defeat of her gallant forces by one small mule. "Private Files, I command you to do your duty," she cried again, and then she herself ducked to escape the mule's heels. For Hank made no distinction in favor of a lady who was an open enemy. Betsy grabbed her champion by the forelock, however, and so held him fast, and when the officers saw that the mule was restrained from further attacks, they crept fearfully back and picked up their discarded swords. "Private Files, seize and bind these prisoners!" screamed the Queen. "No," said Files, throwing down his gun and removing the knapsack, which was strapped to his back. "I resign my position as the army of Oogaboo. I enlisted to fight the enemy and become a hero. But if you want me to someone to bind harmless girls, you will have to hire another private." Then he walked over to the others and shook hands with Shaggy and Tik-Tok. "Treason!" shrieked Anne, and all the officers echoed her cry. "Nonsense," said Files. "I've the right to resign if I want to." "Indeed you haven't," retorted the Queen. "If you resign, it will break up my army, and then I cannot conquer the world." She now turned to the officers and said, "I must ask you to do me a favor. I know it is undignified in officers to fight, But unless you immediately capture Private Files and force him to obey my orders, there will be no plunder for any of us. Also, it is likely that you will all suffer the pangs of hunger, and when we meet a powerful foe, you are liable to be captured and made slaves." The prospect of this awful fate so frightened the officers that they drew their swords and rushed upon Files, who stood next to Shaggy in a truly ferocious manner. The next instant, however, they halted and again fell upon their knees, for there, before them, was the glistening love magnet held in the hand of the smiling Shaggy Man, and the sight of this magic talisman at once won the heart of every Oogaboite. Even Anne saw the love magnet, and forgetting all enmity and anger, she threw herself upon the Shaggy Man and embraced him lovingly. Quite disconcerted by this unexpected effect of the love magnet, Shaggy disengaged himself from the Queen's encircling arms and quickly hid the talisman in his pocket. The adventurers from Oogaboo were now his firm friends, and there was no more talk about conquering and binding any of his party. "If you insist on conquering anyone," said Shaggy, "you may march with me to the underground kingdom of Ruggedo. To conquer the world, as you have set out to do, you must conquer everyone under its surface as well as those upon its surface, and no one in all the world needs conquering so much as Ruggedo." "Who is he?" asked Anne. "The Metal Monarch of the Gnome King, the King of the Gnomes." "Is he rich?" inquired Major Stockings in an anxious voice. "Of course," answered Shaggy. "He owns all the metal that lies underground, gold, silver, copper, brass, and tin. He has an idea he owns all the metals above ground, for he says all metal was once part of his kingdom. So, by conquering the Metal Monarch, you will win all the riches in the world." "Ah!" exclaimed General Apple, heaving a deep sigh. "That would be plunder worth our while. Let's conquer him, Your Majesty." The Queen looked reproachfully at Files, who was sitting next to the lovely princess, and whispering in her ear. "Alas," said Anne, "I no longer have an army. I have plenty of brave officers indeed, but no private soldier for them to command. Therefore I cannot conquer Ruggedo and win all his wealth." "Why don't you make one of your officers the private?" asked Shaggy. But at once every officer began to protest, and the Queen of Oogaboo shook her head as she replied, "That is impossible. A private soldier must be a terrible fighter, and my officers are unable to fight. They are exceptionally brave in commanding others to fight, but could not themselves meet the enemy and conquer." "Very true, Your Majesty," said Colonel Plum eagerly. "There are many kinds of bravery, and one cannot be expected to possess them all. I myself am brave as a lion in all ways, until it comes to fighting, but then my nature revolts. Fighting is unkind and liable to be injurious to others, so, being a gentleman, I never fight." "Nor I," shouted each of the other officers. "You see," said Anne, "how helpless I am. Had not Private Files proved himself a traitor and a deserter, I would gladly have conquered this Ruggedo. But an army without a private soldier is like a bee without a stinger." "I am not a traitor, Your Majesty," protested Files. "I resigned in a proper manner, not liking the job. But there are plenty of people to take my place. Why not make the Shaggy Man a private soldier?" "He might be killed," said Anne, looking tenderly at Shaggy, "for he is mortal and able to die. If anything happened to him, it would break my heart." "It would do me worse than that," declared Shaggy. "You must admit, Your Majesty, that I am commander of this expedition, for it is my brother we are seeking, rather than plunder. But I and my companions would like the assistance of your army, and if you help us to conquer Ruggedo and rescue my brother from captivity, we will allow you to keep all the gold and jewels and other plunder you may find." This prospect was so tempting that the officers began whispering together, and presently Colonel Cheese said, "Your Majesty, by combining our brains, we have just evolved a most brilliant idea. We will make the Clockwork Man the private soldier." "Who, me?" asked Tik-Tok. "Not for a single second. I cannot fight, and you must not forget that it was Ruggedo who threw me in the well." "At that time you had no gun," said Polychrome, "but if you join the army of Oogaboo, you will carry the gun that Mr. Files used." "A soldier must be able to run as well as to fight," protested Tik-Tok, "and if my works run down, as they often do, I could neither fight nor run." "I'll keep you wound up, Tik-Tok," promised Betsy. "Why, that isn't a bad idea," said Shaggy. "Tik-Tok will make an ideal soldier, for nothing can injure him except a sledgehammer. And since a private soldier seems to be necessary to this army, Tik-Tok is the only one of our party fitted to undertake the job." "What must I do?" asked Tik-Tok. "Obey orders," replied Anne. "When the officers command you to do anything, you must do it. That is all." "And that's enough, too," said Files. "Do I get a salary?" inquired Tik-Tok. "You get your share of the plunder," answered the Queen. "Yes," remarked Files. "One half of the plunder goes to the Queen, and the other half is divided among the officers, and the private gets the rest." "That will be satisfactory," said Tik-Tok, picking up the gun and examining it wonderingly, for he had never before seen such a weapon. Then Anne strapped the knapsack to Tik-Tok's copper back and said, "Now we are ready to march to Ruggedo's kingdom and conquer it. Officers, give the command to march." "Fall in!" yelled the generals, drawing their swords. "Fall in!" cried the colonels, drawing their swords. "Fall in!" shouted the majors, drawing their swords. "Fall in!" bawled the captains, drawing their swords. Tik-Tok looked at them, and then around him in surprise. "Fall in what? The well?" he asked. "No," said Queen Anne. "You must fall in marching order." "Can't not I march without falling into it?" asked the Clockwork Man. "Shoulder your gun and stand ready to march," advised Files. So Tik-Tok held the gun straight and stood still. "What next?" he asked. The Queen turned to Shaggy. "Which road leads to the Metal Monarch's cavern?" "We don't know, Your Majesty," was the reply. "But this is absurd," said Anne with a frown. "If we can't get to Ruggedo, it's certain that we can't conquer him." "You're right," admitted Shaggy, "but I did not say we could not get to him. We only have to discover the way, and that was the matter we were considering when you and your magnificent army arrived here." "Well then, get busy and discover it," snapped the Queen. That was no easy task. They all stood looking from one road to another in perplexity. The paths radiated from the little clearing like the rays of the midday sun, and each path seemed like all the others. Files and the Rose Princess, who had been by this time become good friends, advanced a little way along one of the roads and found that it was bordered by pretty wild flowers. "Why don't you ask the flowers to tell you the way?" he said to his companion. "The flowers?" returned the princess, surprised at the question. "Of course," said Files. "The field flowers must be second cousins to a rose princess, and I believe if you ask them, they will tell you." She looked more closely at the flowers. There were hundreds of white daisies, golden buttercups, bluebells, daffodils growing along by the side. Each flower head was firmly set upon its slender but stout stem. There were even a few wild roses scattered here and there, and perhaps it was the sight of these that gave the princess courage to ask the important question. She dropped to her knees facing the flowers and extended both her arms pleadingly toward them. "Tell me, pretty cousins," she said in her sweet, gentle voice, "which way will lead us to the kingdom of Ruggedo, the Gnome King?" At once, all the stems bent gracefully to the right, and the flower heads nodded once, twice, thrice in that direction. "That's it!" cried Files joyfully. "Now we know the way." Ozga rose to her feet and looked wonderingly at the field flowers, which had now resumed their upright position. "Was it the wind, do you think?" she asked in a low whisper. "No, indeed," replied Files. "There is not a breath of wind stirring, but these lovely blossoms are indeed your cousins, and answered your question at once, as I knew they would." that is the end of our chapter and the end of what we will be reading this week. I hope you're enjoying the story and getting to know the new characters and the adventure that they are on. Tune back on Monday and we will find out what happens in the Gnome King's kingdom and whether they're able to find it and what will occur as they try to conquer him. So I hope that you have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend and come back on Monday. Until then, enjoy your weekend.